He stumbled at the curb, a young Marine, bleeding, his uniform torn. Someone had already attacked him. Emily Carter didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees, pressed her hands to his wounds, trying to keep him alive. That's when the attacker came back, with a knife. She could have run. Instead, she threw herself over his body and took 7 stab wounds meant for him. No weapon, no armor, just instinct and courage. She barely survived. And the next morning, 2 black SUVs pulled up outside her house. What the Marines brought with them left the whole street silent. For more true stories like this, hit subscribe. These are the moments the world needs to remember. Emily Carter's shift had been blessedly quiet. 12 hours without a code blue, without the hollow silence of cardiac monitors going flat. It was the kind of day EMTs secretly pray for but never expect. She'd scrubbed out just after sunset, exhausted in that heavy-limbed way that crept up after a long shift. Still wearing her navy blue uniform pants and a faded hoodie over her scrubs, she made a quick stop at the strip mall down the street to pick up frozen meals and ibuprofen. Her ponytail was slipping, and she had a dull ache in her lower back, but that was normal. Normal was good. She stepped out of the market with a brown paper bag in one hand, keys and phone in the other. The parking lot glowed orange under the aging streetlights. The taco shop 2 stores down buzzed with laughter and tinny music. People milled about, scrolling their phones, waiting on to-go orders. She might have missed him if she hadn't turned her head at just the right moment. A man young, maybe mid-20s, staggered into the light. At first, she assumed he was drunk. Tourists wandered the neighborhood all the time. But then she saw the uniform. A torn Marine combat shirt, one sleeve shredded, the other darkened with blood, his left leg dragged, and his right hand was pressed tight against his ribs. He looked like a ghost pale, shaking, half present. Emily dropped her bag instantly. Hey, sit down," she said, already moving. "You're bleeding." He didn't speak, just nodded once and collapsed as she caught him. Her hands moved fast, automatic. Pressure on the wound, scan for others. Call it an instinct honed through too many midnights with too many sirens. She was about to open a gauze pack when something shifted. 2 men appeared. Fast. From the alley, maybe, or the sidewalk. She hadn't seen them before. One wore a black hoodie pulled low. The other had tattoos curling up the side of his neck. They weren't looking around. They were looking directly at the Marine. "Back off," one growled, stepping closer. Emily stepped between them and the wounded man without thinking. "He needs help," she said, voice steady. "I've called an ambulance." "No one asked you to," the tattooed one snapped. Her gut turned to ice. Behind her, the Marine whispered, hoarse and weak, "They followed me." That was all she needed to hear. She raised her hands, firm but calm. "You're not getting past me." The man in the hoodie lunged. Steel flashed under the streetlight. Time snapped in half. Emily threw her body sideways to cover the Marine. The blade found her arm first hot, blinding pain. Another swipe slashed her back. She didn't fall, didn't move. She screamed but stayed upright. Her body was bleeding, but her stance never broke. She was between the knife and the soldier. That's all that mattered. And then came the 3rd stab. The first stab was fire. The second, ice. By the 3rd, Emily couldn't tell where the pain ended and her body began. The man in the hoodie drove the blade toward the Marine's chest again, and again she blocked its shoulder. First this time, arms up, instinct over agony. Her screams tore through the night air, but the taco shop kept playing music, and the crowd stayed frozen. Phones lifted. No one moved. The tattooed man kicked her hard in the ribs. She fell sideways, but her hands still reached out, clawed at the wrist holding the knife, pulled it down, turned her body to shield the Marine behind her. She could feel him slipping further to the ground, losing blood fast. His eyes were barely open now, breath shallow. She couldn't tell how much of the blood soaking through her shirt was his or hers. A 4th stabber side this time, then a 5th, lower, slicing through the thin fabric of her hoodie and biting into her skin. Her knees buckled, but she refused to fall flat. One leg propped her up. Her arms flailed, striking nothing. She wasn't trained for this. No defense class covered how to survive 7 inches of steel while trying to keep someone else alive. 6. Her hand slipped, fingers slick with blood. She screamed again, more out of frustration than pain now. She didn't want to die here. She didn't want him to die here. She kept repeating it, silently, in rhythm with her heartbeat. Don't let him die. Not here. Not now. Not alone. The 7th strike hit her high on the arm, slicing through muscle. She was still standing, but barely. Her body trembled, soaked in red, vision a thin tunnel of light and shadow. Then, from the distanza, voice. Leave her alone. Louder than the crowd. A single man's voice, sharp, cracking the paralysis in the air. The attackers flinched, looked around, panic in their eyes now. And just like that, they ran. Emily dropped to her knees. The Marine was flat on the ground. His head lolled to the side. She pressed both hands to his side, weak but determined. I've got you, she gasped, voice ragged. Stay with me. Sirens screamed through the night. Red and blue lights spun wildly across the pavement. Another EMT, maybe, was suddenly beside her, taking over, shouting for more gauze, for suction, for a gurney. Emily couldn't answer. She slumped sideways, the world tilting, blurring. The last thing she saw was a face above her stranger, nurse, maybe just a good Samaritan, and the sky behind him turning dark with sirens. Her body was trembling. Her lips moved, barely. Don't let him. Then, nothing. She flatlined in the ambulance. 90 seconds without a pulse. 2 shocks. Oxygen forced through a mask. Her lung zone collapsed, fought to inflate. Her blood pressure crashed. They lost her again for 5 more seconds. And then, suddenly, she was back. Alive. But only just. The room was quiet, sterile, except for the rhythmic beeping of machines and the low hiss of oxygen. Emily Carter surfaced slowly, like rising through murky water. Her body felt weighted, numb in some places, on fire in others. Something pinched her nose. Her mouth was dry. Her throat felt like gravel. The ceiling above her swam in and out of focus. White tiles, soft lights, shadows that moved gently. She tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. A nurse appeared almost instantly. A calm face, warm eyes. She leaned over and said softly, "You're okay. You're safe. You made it through surgery." Emily blinked, tried to nod, then regretted it immediately as a bolt of pain shot through her ribs. Every breath scraped against broken bone. Her shoulder throbbed. Her abdomen felt like it had been torn apart and stitched back together, which, in truth, it had. She moved her lips again, struggling. The nurse leaned closer. "What is it?" "Marine," Emily whispered, barely audible. Is he okay?" The nurse paused just long enough for doubt to sink in. Then she smiled gently and nodded. "He's alive, thanks to you." A single tear rolled down Emily's cheek. The pain in her body was crushing, but that moment, the relief let her breathe a little deeper, even through the agony. Doctors came in an hour later, solemn-faced and amazed. They told her, in clinical tones and reverent glances, that she had been stabbed 7 times. 1 lung collapsed, 2 fractured ribs, 1 sliced tendon, massive blood loss, 4 pints transfused. She had flatlined in the ambulance. And again, briefly, on the table. They didn't expect her to survive the second hit, but she did. "You're a miracle," one surgeon said. Emily didn't feel like one. She felt broken, raw. But the Marine was alive. That was enough. What she didn't know, what no one told her just yet, was that the man she saved was Corporal James Rivas, and that his injuries weren't random. Investigators had already connected the attack to a known gang operating in the area, a crew with a record of harassing off-duty service members, especially those who stepped out of line. Weeks before, Rivas had disrupted a shady exchange near the base and filed a report. Quiet, official, and not meant to go further. But it did. And someone decided to make an example of him. They hadn't counted on her. Not on Emily Carter. Not on the way she'd stand there, bleeding, body breaking, and still refuse to let him fall. The quiet hum of machines was the only sound in Emily's room that morning. Outside, the sun was rising behind hospital blinds, throwing soft, golden lines across her bedsheets. Her body still ached in every place that mattered. Breathing hurt. Laughing was out of the question. But she was alive, and so was the Marine. That fact alone kept her from slipping into despair. A soft knock came at the door. One not like the steady rhythm of nurses or doctors. It was precise, intentional. Emily turned her head slowly, wincing, just as a man in full Marine dress stepped inside. He was tall, composed, and carried the quiet authority of someone who had stood in the worst kinds of chaos and never flinched. His uniform was immaculate, his posture straight, the kind of presence that filled a room without saying a word. "Miss Carter," he said, voice calm, respectful. Emily nodded, confused, already trying to sit up before a jolt of pain froze her halfway. "Easy," he said gently. "No need to get up." He stepped closer and offered a small smile. "I'm Captain Ramirez. I'm here on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and Corporal James Rivas." Emily blinked. The name wasn't familiar, but the word corporal was. The Marine, the man she'd shielded. She hadn't known his name until now. "James asked me to come personally," Ramirez continued. "He's still recovering, but he insisted." He reached into his coat and removed a small, weathered object. Bronze. Round. Heavy with meaning. He placed it carefully on the tray table beside her lunch untouched. "This is a challenge coin," he said. "It bears the emblem of the Corps. It's not something we give out lightly." Emily stared at it, overwhelmed. "I didn't." Her voice cracked. "I just reacted. That's all." Ramirez didn't flinch. "No. That kind of instinct doesn't come from training. It comes from character." She swallowed hard, eyes stinging. "I'm not a Marine." "No," he said. "But you lived like one that night." She looked down at the coin, running a finger over its rough edge. "He would have died." Ramirez nodded. "He didn't. Because you stood between him and death. That makes you family." Emily couldn't speak after that. She didn't need to. Ramirez nodded once, firmly, then turned to leave. Before he stepped out, he paused and looked back. "He asked me to tell you one more thing. He remembers everything, every second. And he said to tell you, thank you for not letting go." The door closed gently behind him. And Emily Carter, stitched and battered and still wrapped in the fog of trauma, sat in silencer, fingers curled tightly around the coin, her heart pounding not from fear, but from something else. Honor. The hospital room felt quiet, finally. Emily had managed to sit upright for the first time since surgery, her stitches pulling with every breath. Her hand still bandaged where she'd tried to grab the attacker's blood trembled slightly as she reached for the paper cup of water on the tray. Her mom sat nearby reading, pretending not to watch her every move, but Emily could feel her eyes from across the room. A nurse walked in, holding a tablet. She wore the kind of expression Emily had come to dread, gentle, cautious, brimming with meaning. "There's something you should see," the nurse said, setting the tablet on the tray table. "It's already everywhere." Emily frowned. "What is it?" The nurse hesitated, then tapped play on a shaky, zoomed-in video. It was grainy, unsteady, shot from across the parking lot, but there was no mistaking what it showed. Her, standing in front of the wounded Marine, hands out, blocking two men. Then steel flashed. The blade hit. She watched herself jerk with the impact, bend but not fall, The Marine collapsed behind her. She stayed upright, took another hit, screamed, pushed back. The angle didn't catch everything, but it was enough. Enough to make your stomach turn. Enough to make your heart stop. Enough to go viral. Emily didn't speak, just watched the last seconds of the clip until the screen cut to black. "I don't want to see it again," she whispered. The nurse nodded and backed away, but it was too late. By that afternoon, it had already climbed past 3 million views. News stations picked it up by evening. Talk shows debated her courage. Commentators dissected her movements like she'd been trained, like it had been tactical, rehearsed, as if survival looked good in slow motion. They called her the Shield, EMT. Hashtags exploded. Emily Strong, Shield of Honor, Hero in Scrubs. The hospital's phones rang non-stop. Reporters camped outside the ER. Someone even tried to sneak onto her floor. A security guard now sat outside her door. Emily turned off her phone, unplugged the TV, asked the nurses to screen every call. She hadn't done it for a camera. She hadn't even known one was rolling. All she'd done was bleed so someone else could live. And now, the world wanted to make her into something she wasn't ready to be. A hero. The house smelled like coffee and antiseptic. Emily Carter moved slowly down the hallway, her bare feet brushing the cool wood floor, each step careful, deliberate. Stitches tugged at her side. Her arm ached. Her ribs throbbed with every breath. The doctors had warned her the healing would be slow, and they were right. But at least she was home. The morning was still dim. Early light crept through the blinds, casting pale lines across the living room rug. Her mother had insisted on staying the night, sleeping in the chair beside Emily's bed, just in case. Now, Emily stood in the kitchen, leaning on the counter, trying to pour herself a mug of tea with one hand. Then came the knock. Not loud, not frantic, just steady, measured. Her mother looked up from the couch, brows knitting. Emily didn't think anything of it. Probably a neighbor, maybe a delivery left behind. Her mother crossed to the door, and then she gasped. "Emily," she said, her voice cracking. "You need to see this." Emily limped to the hallway, her fingers still wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. She stopped at the edge of the front door and peered around her mother's shoulder, and froze. Outside, stretching across the entire street, stood over 100 Marines, shoulder to shoulder, silent, unmoving, dressed in full blues. Their shoes gleamed in the dawn light. Their posture was flawless, their faces solemn. Directly in front, at the center of the formation, stood Corporal James Rivas. No cane, no assistants, just upright and proud, medals on his chest, eyes locked on the door. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Without a word, every Marine lifted their arm. The sound of over 100 salutes snapping into place echoed down the street. She stepped out onto the porch, one hand braced against the railing, her other clutching the mug tight enough her knuckles went white. The cool air hit her face. Her body trembled, not from pain, but from disbelief. Rivas stepped forward slowly, boots hitting pavement in deliberate rhythm. He stopped at the edge of her lawn. "You stood between death and one of ours," he said, voice clear and unwavering. "Today, we stand for you." Emily's hand flew to her mouth. Tears spilled before she could stop them. Her body ached in every way, but for the first time since that night, she felt something else break through the fog. Honor. The kind you don't ask for. The kind you earn. The visit started quietly. At first, Rivas came once a week, showing up with stiff posture and a military-issue politeness that made Emily smile more than she let on. He never stayed long, just enough to check on her stitches, ask about physical therapy, and bring her small things she hadn't asked for. A paperback book, a stress ball shaped like a brain, her favorite lemon muffins from a cafe she hadn't visited since the stabbing. He always stood just inside the doorway at first, like he didn't want to take up space. She never told him, but his presence steadied her in a way nothing else could. Then came the second week, and the one after that. Soon it became routine. They'd sit on the porch steps as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to the slow hum of their quiet neighborhood. Words came when they needed to, but often they didn't. Sometimes silence was easier, calmer. In that space between sentences, something began to settle, a kind of peace neither of them had known in a while. One day, he brought her a plastic shopping bag. "What's that?" she asked, half suspicious, half curious. "Your new battle," he said, grinning. Inside were 2 Lego sets sewn, a miniature helicopter, the other, a battleship. She laughed, shaking her head. "You're kidding." "Fine motor skills," he said. "Doctor, approved. Marine, tested." They spent hours on the living room rug, both cross-legged, both hurting in quiet ways they didn't need to explain. Emily struggled to grip the tiny blocks with her recovering hand, but Rivas never rushed her. When she finally locked one piece into place, her eyes filled without warning. He didn't say a word, just handed her the next piece and kept building. They didn't talk about the night of the attack much. The blood, the fear. It was all there, somewhere beneath the surface, but it didn't need to be said. The scars on their bodies, the slow way they moved, the breath they still caught mid-sentence, that was enough. They were 2 people who had bled into each other's stories. And now, slowly, they were learning how to live again, side by side. The room was quieter than she expected. No flashing cameras, no dramatic music, just polished floors, folded flags, and the low murmur of officers shifting in their seats. The walls of the Marine Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C., held history like breath-thick, reverent, impossible to ignore. Emily Carter stood near the podium, palms sweating, the hem of her black dress brushing against her knees. Her legs still ached from the flight. Her side twinged with every inhale. A scar, just beneath her ribs, throbbed against the seam of her dress. She hadn't wanted to come at first. The award felt too big, too heavy. The words "Distinguished Public Service" didn't sit comfortably on her shoulders. She'd told the Marines she wasn't a hero. She was just someone who didn't walk away. But the letter had come anyway, signed by the commandant himself. And Rivas had looked her in the eye and said, "You stood up when no one else did. Let them thank you." So now here she was, standing in front of more medals and rank stripes than she could count, while a major read a citation she could barely hear over the sound of her own pulse. Her name was said with precision. Her story recited like folklore. They called her courageous, brave, unshakable. It felt surreal, like they were talking about someone else entirely. When the commandant stepped forward and placed the medal in her hand, it felt cool, deliberate, heavy. The weight of what she'd done her, what the world believed she'd done, settled against her skin like armor she wasn't sure she deserved. She lowered her gaze, unsure what to do next. That's when she saw him. Front row, second seat from the left. Corporal James Rivas. Uniform crisp, shoulders squared, face unreadable but eyes alive. He didn't salute, didn't smile. He just nodded. Once. Slow. Certain. That was all she needed. In that single moment, something inside Emily clicked into place. Maybe it wasn't about deserving. Maybe it wasn't even about bravery. Maybe it was just about showing up when it mattered, no matter the cost. And maybe that really was enough. The air was still at Arlington. Wind moved gently through the rows of white headstones like fingers turning pages. Flags rustled against polished brass poles. The sky overhead was a soft, cloudless blue, mercifully quiet. Emily Carter stood just off the main path, waiting for her cue. Her dress was a deep navy, simple and clean. The Marine Corps pin rested over her heart. It wasn't the medal they'd given her that day in Washington. It was smaller, quieter, but it meant more. Around her, the crowd shifted in reverent silence. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the grass. Uniforms in every branch. Gold Star families, generals, recruits. wounded warriors in wheelchairs, young cadets in dress whites sitting up straighter than they probably had all day. And in the third row, she saw them again, the Marines. The same formation that had saluted her on her front lawn. Today, they weren't standing in formation. They sat among the crowd like everyone else. But still, she could feel their presence like the weight of a promise kept. When the speaker before her finished, Emily stepped forward. She hadn't written her speech to impress anyone. She hadn't rehearsed it in front of mirrors or coaches. She'd written it at her kitchen table, long after midnight, when the world was quiet enough to hear herself think. Every word came from the memory of a blade, a body on the ground, and a choice made without hesitation. Her voice was steady. "I'm not a soldier," she began. "I've never deployed. I've never worn rank. But I've worked beside warriors, and I've carried people who were." She glanced at the headstones, at the crowd, at the space Rivas had helped her step into. "Courage doesn't always wear a uniform," she said. "Sometimes it just shows up. Bleeding, unarmed, standing between someone and death." The silence after that line was thick. You could hear breath catch. You could hear pride settle like dust. She ended simply. "I didn't act that night because I was brave. I acted because I could. And I believe that's what makes a country strong when ordinary people refuse to be bystanders." The ovation rose like a wave. Some stood slowly, wiping their eyes. Others jumped up, clapping, saluting. One young cadet, barely old enough to shave, leaned to his friend and whispered, "She's why I joined." Emily didn't hear him, but Rivas did, and he smiled. The curb hadn't changed. Same cracked concrete, same faded paint on the parking lines. The taco shop still smelled like grilled onions and frying oil, and the same neon sign flickered just above the door, humming faintly in the warm afternoon breeze. It had been 1 year since the night everything changed, since Emily Carter had bled into the sidewalk holding pressure on a stranger's wounds while shielding him with her own body. Now, the scar on her side tugged faintly beneath her sweater as she knelt, slow and careful, beside the exact spot where she had fallen. In her hand, a single red flower. Not a bouquet. Not a display. Just one. She placed it gently near the edge of the curb, then brushed her fingers along the pavement. For a second, she let the memory rise. The flash of steel, the weight of the Marines slumping behind her, the sound of sirens cracking the air. She whispered, "Thank you," but not to herself. To the moment, to the silence that followed it, to the pain that had taught her how far compassion could carry a person. Behind her, the world moved normally. A car idled nearby. 2 teens argued over a burrito order. But then, a small voice interrupted. "Are you the hero lady?" Emily turned and found a little girl, maybe 6 years old, staring up at her with wide brown eyes and messy pigtails. She was holding her mother's hand but had let go to step forward. Emily smiled and knelt, wincing only slightly. "No," she said softly. "I'm just someone who helped." The girl looked thoughtful, then nodded, as if that made even more sense than being a hero. She returned to her mother, and Emily rose to her feet again. Rivas was standing across the street, waiting. He hadn't rushed her. He never did. When she crossed to him, he took her hand without a word. They walked away together, the wind curling gently behind them. No cameras, no applause, just the two of them, alive and still healing, stepping into a quiet future. Not built on fame, not even on memory. Built on something better. What's right?